my name is Carolyn Ducey. I am the Artist B. James Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. We're a part of the University of Nebraska. And this year at Festival of Quilts, we've brought quilts from our Helen and Robert Cargo collection of African American quilts from the Alabama area, counties around Montgomery, Alabama. And they're really a special group of quilts for us. They represent one of the most important collections of African American quilts that exists, primarily because of the wonderful documentation that Robert Cargo did. He traveled the countryside, he saw these quilts on clotheslines outside of homes, and he got to know a number of quilters very well and really advocated for them and their quilts. So in an unusual fact, many of these quilts have known makers, and we know that oftentimes with quilts we just don't have that information because people didn't sign their quilts or they weren't documented properly. This is a quilt by one of my absolute favorite quilters in this collection, whose name is Yvonne Wells. And Yvonne started, like many of us do, with really traditional patterns. She learned from her mother and grandmother, but she very quickly realized she really liked the freedom of these story quilts that she would make. So this is one of hers, and this is First Dark. And it's just such a simple but powerful quilt. And in so many cases, I think Yvonne kind of understands how less can be more in her quilt designs. So Star Puzzle is by Nora Ezel, who was a really prolific quilt maker, and we have numerous quilts from her in the Cargo collection. We had the opportunity to go to Robert Cargo's home in Alabama. He was a folk art collector, and he had hundreds of quilts, and he let us kind of tailor the collection, pick out what we were really drawn to. And Nora Ezel is such an amazing quilt maker. We ended up with quite a number of her pieces. One of the things that I think is so interesting, and I think Nora's quilts really prove the point, that when we got these quilts in 2000, there was a perception that you could identify an African American made quilt just by the way they were put together, their improvisational style. And some quilters who are used to points matching and making things perfect really said, this style is not, it doesn't indicate that they were really great quilters. Well, I really disagree with that, because I think if you look at Nora Ezel, even though her formatting and the overall presence of her quilt is very improvisational, when you see Star Puzzle particularly, if you can make a star flat in the center like this is one of the most difficult patterns to create. You are a skilled quilt maker. You know what you're doing. And the way she breaks that up and uses those bits and parts of that star pattern throughout the quilt is masterful. And so I think that she actually has had some great notoriety. There's a wonderful book about Nora, and she's just an astounding quilt maker in my opinion. So this is our second Nora Ezel quilt that we brought to Festival this year. It's called an Everybody quilt, and I think it's because there's a little something for everyone in the pattern. And it's very much based on what we would call kind of a crazy quilt pattern, especially when you notice the quilting or the embroidery stitches she's done around each of these shapes. And again, it's just one of the qualities of these quilts is that the makers used any kind of fabrics that they had. So in this quilt, you'll see cottons, synthetics, silks, just everything and anything, and the use of color. And that's actually something that one of probably the most popular comments we've had this weekend is the vibrant color of these quilts. And I feel like there's something so joyous about them because the makers made them without having to fit some kind of a rule or some kind of prescribed patterning. They sat down, they picked up fabric, they laid them next to each other, they loved the combination, and they put them together with a real freedom. And as someone who cannot piece and make points come together, this is the kind of quilt that has really inspired me because it shows it's really not about the individual elements always, it's about the overall patterning and the overall look of the quilt. And I just feel like they are just such joyous quilts. So another one of the quilters that really stands out in the Cargo collection is Mary Matchson, and this is her log cabin variation. The cargo collection, the quilts were collected in the 70s, collected and made in the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is a 1994 quilt, so they really are of our era, our contemporaries. But Mary Matchett also was a really prolific quilt maker. Dr. Cargo often would tell us the story of, that these women were really economically challenged and they needed quilts for warmth. So they would make a quilt for each family member and they would stack the quilts in the corner. But even after they had enough for the family, for the entire family, they loved quilt making, and so that stack would just continue to grow. And this is a very simple and effective pattern. It's kind of a half log cabin. And I'm always drawn to this one because, well, the combination of all the different fabrics, the way she created her log cabin logs by combining fabrics, but the simplicity of it, and then the beautiful red sashing gives you this depth to it, so it's almost like you're looking through window panes into this patterning, and I just find that is such an effective means of creating just like I said, a depth to the quilt, so you just can look and look and look at it. I also think it's so interesting that so oftentimes these crazy fabrics that were used, I would never think of putting these colors together. It just doesn't seem like it's something you would do, but yet I've really been inspired by these quilts to be much more free and fun with my quilts and not get too caught up in how the perfect colors that we're so used to seeing. It's much more fun to do something unusual, and when you see the quilt overall, it sparkles in a way because of that. Well, Roberta Jemison is another name that is a well-known quilt maker in the Robert Cargo collection, and this star quilt has been just absolutely, I think, our viewers' favorite, and we did position it in a way that emphasized it because first of all, there's something about the star pattern, and we would call this a lone star, or there's all kinds of different names for this. And this is a very traditional quilt pattern. We see these as early as the 1830s in big numbers, but it is one of the most difficult patterns to make. And again, it shows you that in many ways, Roberta was not really concerned with how things matched up. You see the points don't always match, but again, you can create that flat center. I tried this pattern once. My center stood up about 4 inches because you don't know how it's going to go together until you put all of the different different arms of the quilt, all 8 of them together. And then when you do that final 2 halves, that's when the quilt really sticks up and you know if you've been successful or not. I even tried paper piecing it and it didn't work. So I have great respect for makers who use it. But it's also the way that the colors are used, and and these are complementary colors, the blue and orange, the red and green. So obviously Roberta just had an amazing color sense that must have just been innate to her eye and just pleasing to her eye. And these quilts have a movement, a visual tension in them. Your eye just keeps moving, and different parts of the quilt seem to come, appear or advance and recede as you look at it. And I just think it is something that I could live with every single day. It's such a beautiful quilt. So another traditional pattern, this is Broken Dishes by Dennis Jones, one of the few men in the Cargo collection. And what a simple pattern, or just all triangles done in kind of an hourglass with a Broken Dishes pattern, and with the craziest fabrics in it. I mean, we have corduroy, we have polyesters, we have synthetics. And again, it's just that pure joy of the way that the pieces are put together. You start to think, oh look, he did a border down the side, or he did a border around it, and then you realize he breaks that up. And so there's really no rhyme or reason to it, but I think that's part of the joy in the creation. The other thing we see, these quilts tend to have a very thick batting or wadding in them, and so we see a lot of large quilting stitches going through them. And I think it gives such a great texture to these quilts. And I really like the big stitching. Now, part of that, as a quilt maker or wannabe quilt maker, I'm a curator, not a quilt maker, but I like using the big stitches because it goes a little faster. But I like also the fact that you see your stitches, you see that personal touch in your hand stitching, and I love the added element that it gives to the quilt and the texture that it gives to the quilt. So this is a quilt by Eva Burrell, done in the early 1990s. And we've been sitting across from this quilt for a couple days now, and that is one of the things that's so amazing about this quilt, is that every time I look at it, I notice another detail about it. From a distance, I find that the fabric that the maker has used between her strips, the way the design goes from one strip to the next, gives you such, again, a quilt with a great sense of depth. But it also, it's the layering, the overlay that she's created with that, and the way you can see the pattern behind it. And she's using anything and everything. So we even have text, we have instructions here. There must have been some kind of a pattern here that came with text. You see the salvage edge of the fabric. And she's using everything she has. There is definitely kind of a rhythm to the strip piecing. So you see blocks of the same kind of color being used. I think it's just masterful in the way that it's all pulled together. And I just find it fascinating that it has that real sophistication in its design. And when you spend some time with it, you've just come to love this quilt more and more every day as we've enjoyed it. And when we set up the exhibition, we very deliberately decided these are the quilts that we want to see all weekend, because we've been enjoying them and looking at them now for 2 days. We're on day 3 with one more to go. So we've really gotten to know these quilts, and this one has very much grown on me as the show's gone on. We are here at the festival surrounded by so many contemporary quilts and modern quilts. And here's Eva Burrell, this is Lurica Outland. And her teacup quilt is so modern in its overall look. I find it so intriguing that, modern quilts is a really new phenomenon. But when you compare and contrast them with traditional quilts, you so often see the same elements, the repetition of form. It's kind of an Andy Warhol kind of feel to it. I've only seen 2 or maybe 3 teacup quilts in my career, and so they're an unusual pattern, but that repetition of form is so wonderful. And the contrast of colors, the way the yellow sashing is so bright, and then I really like the way it creates that offbeat rhythm when you see some lines are very straight, very rigid, but then the other setting lines are really offbeat, and it gives you just such a dynamic quilt. Again, it really creates this feeling of movement so that your eye keeps going from spot to spot to spot, and I think that's a really important element for this quilt to have. It's just a really fun, happy quilt, and I'm really enjoying seeing it today. So I hope you've enjoyed our little tour of some of our African American quilts. We're the International Quilt Museum. We're at internationalquiltmuseum.org, and we've only looked at a handful of the Cargo collection today. There are over 140 of Cargo's quilts in our collection, and you can see them all on our website. So all of our quilts are on our website. We're about 6,000 now to inspire you. And then all of our exhibitions as well. And we have a new program. You can literally walk through our exhibitions now. You can read all the labels. You can zoom in on the quilt. So there's a lot to see at our website if you can't make it to Nebraska. But we really hope you can make it. Put that on your bucket list. Come visit us in Nebraska someday. Thanks so much for visiting.